an introduction to literature. The topic this time is psychological realism, local color, impressionism. We'll also be covering romanticism as a comparison to the two. In fact, we'll start out with that sheet on realism and romanticism. So, of course, we've done a lot with now, what we've been covering before, the rational. Remember, the rationalists generally wrote essays, or they wrote Puritan sermons. You know, things that dealt primarily with ideas, step by step, giving information, explaining information, largely trying to teach people things. That same attitude comes back again and is applied to fiction, mostly towards after the Civil War. Increasingly, Romanticism begins to lose ground. Now, Romanticism never goes out completely. It's always around. It's always the thing that appeals to the great mass of people. Again, the more realism being more intellectual automatically narrows its audience somewhat. So the ideas from rationalism really come back, and when they're applied to fiction, they turn into realism. So a lot of the contrasts that you can see on that paper are really very similar to the contrast that we saw last week between rationalism and romanticism. For example, romanticism was anti-rational and realism is anti-romantic. Just the way rationalism had been against the emotionalism of the medieval period. Same dichotomy on the world. The realists say this is the real world, just like the rationalists did. And the romantics, of course, are still hanging on to the idea that this isn't the real world. The physical world is a distorted reflection of an ideal world which exists purely in form and has no physical content to it, but is only reflected in the physical world. And again, that's the lost world. There's a little bit of a pang in all of the romantics. They all want to get back to the lost world, to the ideal world that we came from. Because they accept the idea that this is the real world, realists tried to create a one-to-one correspondence between the event and its literary representation. In other words, it should seem just like it was. Whatever you saw, that's what you ought to put down. And it should feel like the way it was. It should, you should be able to reproduce in words the experience as it occurred. It ought to correspond to the real world. It shouldn't be as Twain, who was more or less a realist, said about Romanticism, that Romanticism was the stuff that only happens in books. And the realist said there's been enough of that artificiality. We're going to write about the real world. And as you can see from that original, that long definition at the top of the page, eventually going out into the real world to see it first, because you've got to observe before, just like rationalism, you've got to observe before you put it down. Going out into the real world turned them into pessimists. They were basically upper middle class writers, a great many of them, and going out and seeing how the rest of the world lived, how the working class lived, just demoralized them. They didn't realize how bad things were, and they turned into naturalists. And we'll get to naturalists next week. Naturalism has got another name called pessimistic realism. In other words, they're picturing the world, but to them, the world is all going downhill. It's all a cruel game, and so on, which we'll get into. Naturalism is, you could also call it depressed realism. The realists got out there, looked at the real world, got so depressed by it, they started writing very depressive kind of fiction where the people are always getting destroyed by the environment and so on. Now that differs, of course, remember, from the romantic approach of things. The romantics weren't trying to present the world as it is. They were trying to present images of the ideal world. Their characters sometimes looked like real-life characters, but for the most part, they were idealized versions of what human beings can be. They were meant to represent ideal good and evil. The two ideal extremes again, two extremes of form. Everything is symbolic to the romantics. So when they try to draw something out of the world, their real intent was not to get that thing exactly as it is in the world, but to get at its meaning, how it's related to the ideal, and then also to set those things up as examples for people to follow. That's, of course, a lot of the realists dealt with the problem of romanticism in their writing. Henry James, Beast in the Jungle, which I'm sure you all read, saying to yourselves, how much longer can this go on? I mean, you get to about a third of the way through that and you're sure that the story's got to be over on the next page. And it isn't. It just keeps on going and on going and on going. James would have been, he was one of those people who was dealing with this problem of the romantic ideal. In other words, James is a realist. He's drawing people as he sees them. His characters, John Marcher and May Bartram, become a tragedy because they believe in the romantic ideal. John Marcher can't believe that the great and terrible thing that's supposed to happen in his life could possibly be falling in love. May Bartram says to him at one point, gee, what you're describing sounds a lot like love. And he says, no, I've had some affairs before, that's not love. And she says, yes, he says, love isn't enough. Love's not all-encompassing. And she says, it's because you've never been in love. It's enough. It's something to shape your life around. But see, that's the romantic ideal. A woman in the 19th century wanted true love. It goes all the way back to that medieval ideal. The knight who has one lady and who is faithful to her through kind of all kinds of obstacles. That comes back in Romanticism. So May Bartram, love is enough. In a sense, she's not as much of a victim of the romantic ideal. For John Marcher, the male ideal is to be a hero of some sort. Notice he says he doesn't care so much what it is that's going to happen to him after a while. It doesn't matter if he's going to be hung or if he's going to have a great scandal, as long as it's significant. See, because you can be a hero by suffering a terrible disaster, as long as you suffer it in a manly fashion, with courage. It's the same set of principles that come out of the medieval tradition. Well, for him, being in love isn't a big enough thing. And because he's trapped in that romantic ideal of being a male hero, he misses out on May Bartram. He can't offer to marry her. He can't accept that she's the center of his life and that the great tragedy is going to be that he had a chance for true love and missed it. Well, that makes him a prisoner of the romantic ideal. And James, like a lot of realistic writers, were saying that people's lives get destroyed by measuring what happens to them against the romantic ideal. So the Romanticists said, if we give a whole lot of pictures of what people ought to be like, then real people will read that and modify their own behavior and become like their ideals. The function of the artist is to set up a pattern that everybody can then apply to their life and follow. We'll all turn into heroes and heroines. We'll all approach the good, approach the ideal again. What the realist said was that's not what happens. People don't look at the ideal and try to live up to it. They look at the ideal and look at their own lives and are never satisfied with their own lives because they never measure up to the ideal. You wait for Prince Charming to come galloping up on his white horse and sweep you off and take you off back to the castle. And then you get back to the castle and it's filled with 25 years worth of dirty dishes while the Prince Charming was out looking for Princess Charming. And the realist said, well, you get there and you look at the dirty dishes and you look at what was supposed to happen, and no matter how good your life is, you're still living in a castle, you're still married to a prince, he's still good looking, you're still good looking, doing the dishes hasn't ruined your looks and so on. You don't appreciate what it is you have because it doesn't measure up to the ideal. So what the realists were saying is that we're going to present the world as it is. If people look at the real world, maybe they'll go on from there and try to improve it. Although the realists were not entirely optimistic even from the beginning. They got more and more pessimistic as they went along. But their initial thing was they dealt quite a bit with characters who are trapped up in believing in the romantic ideal and trying to live up to it and therefore missing out on their real life. And that's what the Beast in the Jungle really says. Is the real beast that leaps out on you is the fact that you have missed it. That your life went by and you didn't appreciate it when it was here. Which, on a realistic level, that is the most terrible thing that can happen to you. Because a realist says you die. End of your life, that's it. If you blew it this time, no second chances. For the romantic, there's another life. And in fact, for some romantics, there's even another life here in a different personality and so on. But to the realist, you should pay attention to now because now is all you're going to get. And if you try to live it in terms of these fantasies, these ideals, you're going to ruin the only life that you have. Then for a realist, I guess the most tragic thing that can happen to you is to get to the end of your life and say, oh, I wish I had done whatever it was that you left undone, that you didn't get to do, because there's no going back. To the realist, if you haven't done something in your life that you wished you had done, you can still get some credit for having passed that up, whatever it was. You can still get a little nobility out of your suffering and so on. You can still get some rewards. And there's another life anyhow. So it doesn't really matter nearly as much to them. Verisimilitude. Now, they were looking for the seemingness of truth. The realists knew that quite often real life is even more coincidental and more seemingly symbolic than even the Romantics painted. But they said if we start painting real life exactly as it truly is, everybody will think from time to time that it's Romanticism. I mean, in real life, sometimes you're in a real bad situation and an accident occurs that gets you out of it. If you do that in a story, that's too artificial. In other words, that's one of the things that the realists complained about. Saving people by coincidences and so on. That the Romantics didn't worry about very much at all. To them, there were no coincidences. That's what the hero gets saved because of the nature of good in the world. Good is going to triumph. So if it takes a coincidence to keep the hero from getting killed, that's perfectly legitimate to do. The realists say that's not legitimate. We can't have coincidences, otherwise we'll look like the realists. So they aim for verisimilitude, the seemingness of truth. Not the way it is exactly, but the way it is, to make it seem as if it's the way it really is. In other words, they wanted to approach reality, they wanted to copy reality as it was, one-to-one correspondence, but they knew that that wasn't always possible, so instead they aimed for verisimilitude. It ought to seem true. You ought to read a realistic story and believe that all of those events really occurred, even if they were made up by the author. Now, where the realists wanted to be faithful to the real world, the world as it is, the Romantics, again, were trying to be faithful to the ideal. They tried to create heroic characters, not because there was anybody in real life who was that perfect, but because the ideal is perfect. So we present the ideal as the character. The character should have a fidelity to the absolute best that he could be, not a fidelity to the way people really are. Realists throw that out the window. They say people ought to be like people. They ought to act like people. It ought to be essentially, now when they say a slice of life, which you see down in number 7, which is also the world as it is, slice of life is just as if you did a little documentary. Somebody follows you around with a camera for 15 minutes or a day or 2 days or whatever it is, and that's what they describe, exactly what happened to you. It should seem just like the story is a little piece taken out of somebody's life, completing all of its details, corresponding to the reality in all of its details. The seemingly, like, for example, verisimilitude in Hemingway, and The Sun Also Rises. He's always using the street names for Paris. He always throws in a little bit of French into the conversation. You know, that's because that is the way you get the feeling of really having been in Paris when you see all of these street names that you assume are really there. So he creates the place as it is. Underlying that idea, of course, is the realism again. The world is what the world is, as opposed to the world being a symbol for the world beyond. Well, where the realist is trying to create a picture of life as it is. Again, the Romantics are more interested in what Wordsworth told them was the center of poetry, but also the center of prose, that is the spontaneous overflow of emotion. How much emotion you can generate in people. That's why if you looked at Poe with the House of Usher and said there are too many coincidences in the end of this, there's no reasonable motivation for the characters to do what it is that they do, Poe would have said, I don't care. Did people get excited by the story? Were they swept up along with it? Did they have a feeling of horror? That's what I'm aiming for, the spontaneous overflow of emotion. To Poe in particular, you couldn't get in contact with the world beyond, because Poe's a romantic. You can't get in contact with the world beyond you can't get in contact with the world beyond unless you can suspend the logical, rational part of you that keeps telling you there is no world beyond. So the best way to get people into a state where they can appreciate that is to stir up their emotions. If you could get people into an extreme emotional state, they won't be rational at all. The rational part that keeps them from seeing the world beyond will be obliterated, and we have the direct kind of perception of the ideal world. So he was always trying to stir up the emotions. His stories are the reason he picked out horror, for example. Most of his things are horror stories. Well, two reasons. One, his life was a horror story and a nightmare, so naturally it came out in his writing. But the other reason was that fear is the easiest emotion to generate. If you want to get people into a strong emotional state, you'll probably have an easier chance doing it with fear than you will with any other emotion. And again, it's getting them into that uncontrolled emotional state is exactly what Poe and most of the other romantics aim for. Because when you get into your emotions, you get into intuition, and that leads you to the ideal world. But first, you've got to get emotions generated to block out the intellectual. You'll notice there's a definite attempt to stay away from the emotions, mostly in realistic writers. John Marcher, in The Beast of the Jungle, never says anything straight out. It's always got little parenthetical phrases hedging what he's saying. As it were, it seems as if, it might be that. You know, he's got all these little sort of apologies for what he's saying already, because he's trying to put words between himself and the emotion, so he doesn't get swept away by the emotion. It's an intellectual approach, like the rationalists. Of course, you can see pretty much the same thing in Hemingway. He's involved with the characters, but he's not carried away with them. It would be hard to imagine Hemingway sitting down and crying while he's writing The Sun Also Rises. But Dickens did that when he did the death of the little match girl, and I think it's in Bleak House. He had to write that, and I don't know if I mentioned, but it was done in installments, and things came over from England. People gathered on the wharf in New York City, shouting up to people on the packet coming over, "What happened to the little match girl? What happened to the little match girl?" And then, finally, after about four installments, the publisher came to him and said, "Charles, it's obvious that this character is going to die. You've got to kill her off." And he still stretched it out about another installment or so, and then finally came to the realization that there was no way. I mean, it was clear to him from the beginning he had to kill that character off. And of course, the little match girl freezes to death. She's poverty-stricken, she can't sell them matches, and we get this little belly. I think it snows on her. Yeah. So she's all nicely covered. It's the Ally McGraw death out of love story. No tubes, no needles, no makeup smeared. I'm going off to heaven with the angels kind of death. And when Dickens wrote that, he sat there and cried all the way through it. Sent the manuscript off to the publisher and said, "These splotches on this paper are my tears." Of course, the little match girl was patterned after his sister-in-law that he was in love with too, so that might have also been part of it. But it was also that idea that he just couldn't, he was so involved with his character. Now, Hemingway is outside his character. They have good and bad in them. In fact, I don't think there's only one hero in the whole of The Sun Also Rises. One character who is good. The bullfighter. He's the only one. Everybody else is basically corrupt. Now the bullfighter gets a little bit corrupted by Lady Brett. But even so, he's the one character that's heroic all the way through. But even him, you don't get a feeling of Hemingway being so involved with him that he worries about, what will happen to the bullfighter if I put him in the ring, will he get killed and so on. If he got the bullfighter gored, Hemingway wouldn't care. I'd care, but he would show that this was a way a man ought to die, because Hemingway was very big on his ideas of macho and, what it was to be male and so on. In any case, though, he was still trying. You don't get the emotional investment out of him that you get out of romantic writers like Dickens, like Poe, and so on, because emotions are not what they're aiming for. They felt that you ought to have absolute truthfulness towards the heroes. No heroes. Everybody has flaws. The flaws are also explainable and understandable. For example, Lady Brett in The Sun Also Rises. It's not until we get fairly far in the book, but eventually we find out that Lady Brett is so distraught because she's gone through a real tough marriage. Her husband was crazy, made her sleep on the floor, used to point a loaded gun at her all the time. She used to have to wait for him to go to sleep and unload it. I mean, that will certainly make you unstable, and Lady Brett's pretty unstable all the way through. Jake seems to be pretty noble most of the time, but of course Jake's got a wound. He's not really capable of making love to Lady Brett, so he's limited in some fashion, and he's aware of his limitations. But they're real people. They're people with real problems. They're not, the perfect knight in shining armor. They're not Luke Skywalker. They're not even, I guess, James Bond. They have good and bad in them, and in fact, maybe they even tend towards the weaknesses more than they tend towards the strength. Because by the time Hemingway writes, we're already through naturalism. We're through that pessimism, but he's part of a very pessimistic group of people because he's that lost generation. They believed in the First World War. They went off to fight it. They got disillusioned, and that led to them being pretty pessimistic. In place of that absolute truthfulness toward the audience, presenting people as they are with all their warts and blemishes, of course, the Romantics had no real interest in that. It didn't embarrass them to manipulate their audience. You have to manipulate their audience. You can't say to somebody, I'm going to make you cry now. I'm going to make you scared now. You've got to do it to them. And you've got to manipulate them in order to do it. And the realists were always very leery of that. They didn't like playing tricks on the reader. They felt you should be truthful to the reader. I'm going to describe the world as it was. This is how it is. Again, the Romantics don't care in the least about manipulating people because, again, they're aimed at the emotions and the sensibilities. The realistic writers now, by the time we get to Hemingway, there doesn't seem to be an attempt to find an underlying scientific reason. In other words, the attempt is no longer to understand human behavior, as it is with James. James is always trying to figure out what's going on in people's minds. How are they how are they dealing with this situation? How does human behavior work? In other words, it's almost as if James watches the world through a microscope. And he's writing down, then they did this, then they did this, and this is the way a character would act in that situation given the motivations we've got for him and so on. Trying to understand the principles of human nature. There isn't as much of an attempt at that understanding, not trying to find scientific principles. By the time Hemingway's writing, he's not trying to find out the scientific principles of human behavior. He's trying to construct a new form of the ideal that disillusioned people can use to live in a world without any values anymore. And of course, the only one he comes up with primarily is courage. That's all you got. Stiff upper lip. Continue to struggle. Wasn't all that optimistic. It didn't cheer people up all that much. But he's no longer saying, let's find out how human beings work. He's saying, I'm going to show you these characters. This is how they work. They lived in a valueless world. This is how they managed to cope with it. That doesn't mean that's the way all human beings work. This is probably what we ought to be aiming towards. So Hemingway starts to shade back towards the romantic in some places. They worried about their effect on their readers. Number 10, the realists. James and Howells in particular, because they knew that their readers were primarily young women, were very careful not to put any profanity into their stories, to deal very, very, very delicately and only with vague kind of hints about sex, whether it was even within marriage. That's something that just wouldn't be discussed very much because you wouldn't want to corrupt the morals of these young, impressionable people. In fact, Howells even, I think, withdrew a manuscript once because he was afraid that it would upset the young ladies who were going to be reading his work too much, and he didn't want to do that to them. In other words, the realists felt a responsibility towards their readers. Romantics didn't feel any responsibility. They knew what they wanted to do to their readers. They wanted to generate emotion in them, and they did whatever was necessary to do it. They created those emotions. If a romantic wrote a very sad story and somebody went out and committed suicide after it, I'm sure they would have been upset. But it wouldn't occur to them ahead of time the way it does. Of course, that sort of fits in with the romantics too. A lot of stuff doesn't occur to the romantics ahead of time. They're not real necessarily far thinking. They're pretty much in the in the now and the sensations and so on. It's the rationalist who looks down the line and says, what are the ramifications of telling young ladies that a certain thing is so? And looks and says, well, that's how it's going to come out, I won't do that. Romantics sort of throw it up in the air. it'll all come out right in the, of course the Romantics had that belief anyway, it's all going to come out right in the end anyhow, so we don't have to worry about manipulating our readers. Simple, direct, reportorial prose. Of course you can see that in Hemingway. The short sentences, a lot of fact, not that much opinion. You can see it also in some of the other writers. I mean, the opening of Currents at Owl Creek Bridge, for example, starts out in who, what, where, when, why. There's the five, the journalistic questions that a lead article in a newspaper is supposed to answer those questions in the first paragraph. The first paragraph of Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge tells you who is there, where it is, what's going on, and then gradually begins to expose the why and the how. But it's short sentences. It starts out being realistic. We'll see later that it's not as good an example of realism as it is of impressionism. But its initial start is also journalistic. But some of that may be because the realists, a large number of the realists were, well, I'll take that back because Crane isn't really a realist. A lot of the writers, however, around that time were journalists first. So you could see how, having developed that style already, they naturally gravitated towards a style which said, we're going to present the real world stark and without comment and elaboration. Same thing, that's classical, remember? Without a whole lot of ornamentation around it. Just basic, simple, stark lines. Balance, unity, harmony. But things which are easy to grasp, basically in outline. It's the Romantic, the medieval, that tradition, which puts a lot of little extra details around it. When they put a building, it's got all kinds of carvings all over it and so on. That dressing it up is really a thing that the Romantics would tend to do. And so they had, naturally, imaginative, flowery, lyrical prose. They were trying as much as possible, again, to write poetry more or less as prose, because their main intent with their prose was to generate the emotions. One of the ways to generate the emotions is to appeal to the senses. If you're going to appeal to the senses, you've got to have a lot of adjectives. And so it's as if the Romantics, for the most part, if they see a noun, they think it's naked unless it's got 3 adjectives before it. So they're continually widening their prose. The realists, like the classical tradition, is always trying to say the most that you can in the least possible space. That idea of compacting things, compression, finding the exact right word. The Romantics would have been more likely to say, well, it's one of these three words is the right word. I'll use all 3 of them. If one of them is good, 3 has got to be even better. So you have the kind of prose that has an exceptional amount of adjectives and elaboration and detail added, whereas you're getting at the starkness of reality generally with the realistic writers. The same way a reporter does when he tries to write journalism. It's supposed to be objective. You're not supposed to put your personal feelings into a newspaper article. And it's almost as if they're doing the same thing in realism. It's just as if they are journalists reporting on real life, but they're doing it in a fictional framework. Interested in the effects of action upon the characters. Now, of course, you can see that there's almost no action that goes on in The Beast in the Jungle. It's hard to figure out how he manages to carry it on all that way, except that the emphasis very, very strongly on the characters. The real action is, I guess, John meets May. May's been in love with John for 10 years. John falls in love with her but doesn't realize it. She dies. He realizes it. That's the plot. And that's, 40 pages or more of very, very thick prose. In fact, James isn't a real good example, though, of that, where it says that they generally tend to use the simple, direct reportorial prose. One reason that James is so complex is that he is loading in a lot of words, the same way that a Romantic would. But his words are not ones that generally conjure up a lot of sensations. His words are ones that dampen down the subjective effect of what he's saying. In other words, there's a lot of emotion in that story, potentially. John's doing a lot of suffering that in a Romantic, we would have a real heavy focus, a narrowing in on how John suffers. Imagine if you believed yourself to be more or less under the sentence of death. At any minute, it could happen to you. The beast may leap out and swallow you. Your whole life becomes an adventure, of course, but at the same time, it's got to be terrifying that at any moment you can die. But we don't get a lot of feeling of, John Marcher's courage in the face of that, or John Marcher's terror. I mean, what happens when John Marcher wakes up at night and wonders, what is it that's going to happen to me? I know it's going to be something big, but I don't know what it is. Is it going to happen now? There's no emphasis on that fear. James loads in the extra words, making him much different than Hemingway, who's also a realist, because his character is always putting words and ideas between him and the emotions of the situation. So James does the same thing for us. Whenever he has to deal with an emotion, he tries to cover it up and make a shield, a wall of words between us and the emotion. Because what he's interested in is how do those events affect the characters. And he's also more interested in their ethical behavior, their moral behavior, than in their emotional behavior. Remember, the romantics aren't that interested in what happens to the character as a result of what happens to him. They're interested in what happens to him. The adventure itself, the events, the car chase. Henry James wrote a car chase. It'd be 400 pages long. Because every time something comes up that almost might kill somebody, we'll have the driver thinking, now should I really go left here and run over the school children, or shall I go straight ahead and maybe bump into the bus? Which is a better thing for me to do, and how will that affect people? Of course, James's character is never going to get the car started to begin with. When the car chase starts, they have to sit there and think, well, this really isn't my car. Is it legitimate for me to take someone else's property, even though I am in pursuit of a felon? They'll never get out of there. They're interested in the effect of action on character. Romantics are interested in the character. We don't, in fact, half the time in the car chase, it doesn't matter who's chasing who. It's the chase that's important. And it's always the chase. It's the action that's important for romanticism. It's the effect on character that's important for realism. Even in Hemingway, when they go to the bullfights, there's less on the bloody bullfight than there is on how everybody is reacting to it. How does Lady Brett look at the bulls? Of course, Lady Brett loves looking at the bulls. She likes all kinds of sensations. Robert gets sick. What's his name? Jake and what's his friend's name that goes with him?
Colin?
No, that's Robert. Bill, yeah, Bill. They're aficionados. They're watching the technique. They understand when the bullfighter brings the bull past his body, when he's in the domain of the bull, and when the bull's in his domain. They watch the technical aspects of it. But again, the emphasis is not on the bullfight, but on the character's reaction to the bullfight, and that's particularly realistic. Character, of course, goes right along with that. It's more important than plot. Lack of plot. Quite often, realistic stories begin in the middle and end in the middle. They don't come to a conclusion that you know for sure what's going on. Now, James's story is not characteristically realistic in that regard, in the sense that there is a resolution. At the very end, John Marcher realizes that he's lost May Bartram and has his heart attack and turns into the beast and falls down on top of her grave. Come to think of it, that's an awfully romantic ending for a guy who said that he was a realist. I mean, it just ties everything up so neatly. We don't have to worry. I mean, we don't have to say, now, what happens now that John Marcher has figured out that he's blown his entire life, and we're going to have him live for 3 more years, pining away over it? No, it's much more tidy to let him have the heart attack or the stroke or whatever it is he has, and fall down right there on the grave, so we've even got a symbolic ending. That's generally not a realistic one. Most realistic stories don't have that kind of neat wrapping up of all of the loose ends. They would end with John Marcher goes off around the world and never comes to that conclusion. That would be a really realistic story. And their grounds for that was, we're describing life. Life hasn't got any plot to it, at least none we can discern. And life hasn't got any neat, tidy endings to things either. You see a car accident, you never find out what happens to the victims. It just passes. You see it, it has an effect on you, and it's gone. And they said that's the way life is. Therefore, that's the way stories ought to be. No manipulation of characters, so it's all tied up at the end. In fact, there doesn't even have to be a resolution. We're just slice of life. This is what happened to this character during this period of time. This is how it affected him. The rest of his life, the preceding part of his life, largely ignored. And of course you can also see that in The Sun Also Rises. It's very episodic. There's no real necessarily logical connection between the events. They go off to fish, but they could have gone off to fish at any time. What happens there is significant, but it doesn't have to occur in that place in the story. It's just that's the way life works. And so it doesn't have that kind of strong motivation and coherence that romantic novels, even episodic romantic novels, still have a coherence to them, that an emphasis on plot that you don't have in the romantics. Again, House of Usher. What's happening to Roderick is more important. You know, if you ask Poe what was the main point of that story, he'd say when Madeline comes out of the grave and breaks down the door and falls on Roderick. That's the important. That's the action. That's what's going to get emphasized. The plot, again, in Romanticism, a series of palpating moments. You want to get people excited. So they're emotional, a series of emotional flashes, one after the other throughout the story. Surface details. Particularly in James, number 15 is true, that the central issue is the individual's response to ethical crisis. In Hemingway, it's the same thing. The theme of Hemingway is, how does the lost generation, a generation of disappointed idealists, go on living in a world in which all values have been destroyed? That's an ethical question. How do you live in a world in which the stuff that you used to believe in has been proved to be nonsense? That's ethics. That's morality. So even in Hemingway, we have basically a moral focus. It's much more clear, of course, in James. James is, everything those characters do is motivated by an ethical standard. For example, you may have wondered when you're reading that story, why doesn't Maid Bartram just say to John Marcher, "I'm it, dummy. This is what you've been waiting for, me. Why don't we get married?" And we've been really having a sort of marriage without sex anyway for all of these years. Why didn't she propose to him, "John, will you marry me?" It seems so simple to us. But that's an ethical problem. You see, that was something that a woman could not have done in the 19th century. It would have been unethical for her to approach him. It would have been too aggressive. She's limited by the rules of her society. She can either break, now in some places she does break the ethics of her society. She goes around with John Marcher without any kind of supervision whatsoever. She meets him in places all over London just the way lovers would meet. So she compromises to some extent. In other words, it's still an ethical problem. She resolves that ethical problem, but she doesn't, she never sacrifices the ethics of her society, which she accepted, in order to save her personal life. She doesn't say to John, "Why don't you marry me?" Also, she's got another ethical reason for that. She doesn't want to put pressure on him. John ought to spontaneously ask her to marry him. If she asks him, then she's pressured him into it. And that's not an ethical thing for her to do. She goes into the relationship with no promises. He never says he's going to marry her. Of course, there isn't, by their standard, there isn't an absolute reason for them to get married. If they were lovers and making love, then they would have to get married. But in this case, they're not. She's never asked for anything, and now, having gone into the relationship that way, it would be unethical for her to make John marry her by bringing up to him how dumb he is. And of course, so she can't do that. Ethics are the center of what's going on there. Also, come to think of it, it's the center of John, too. Find that. Over on the other sheet where it says the biographer of fine consciences. That's what James was described as. Fine meaning delicate. James, of course, being upper class, wrote about upper middle class people, ones for whom ethics can have some meaning because they're basically secure. In other words, you got to worry where your next meal is coming from. Little tiny fine distinction of ethics have no significance for you. You've got to have all the necessities already established before you can start splitting hairs about what's ethical and what isn't ethical. And of course, there's a place there where he realizes he ought to marry May Bartram. It's on 522. The real form it should have taken, on the basis that stood out large, was the form of their marrying. But the devil in that was that the very basis itself put marrying out of the question. That is the very basis for their relationship, namely his secret about what terrible thing is going to happen to him. His conviction, his apprehension, his obsession, in short, wasn't a privilege he could invite a woman to share. And that consequence of it was precisely what was the matter with him. Something or other lay in wait for him amid the twists and turns of the months and years, like a crouching beast in the jungle. It signified little whether the crouching beast were destined to slay him or be slain. The definite point was the inevitable spring of the creature, and the definite lesson that a man of feeling didn't cause himself to be accompanied by a lady on a tiger hunt. Such was the image under which he had ended by figuring his life. In other words, what keeps him from marrying May Bartram isn't entirely his stupidity. It's also his ethics. Something terrible is going to happen to me. I don't have the right to marry May and put her in that danger. If when the beast leaps out, she's there. Of course, she's there with him anyway, so he doesn't really seem to deal with that part of it. But if she marries him and the beast destroys him, then she's going to have to live with that, because she'll be his widow. Somehow, that in his mind seems to be more significant than just that she's been his friend and would have to suffer his loss if the beast jumped out and ate him up. Still, it's the ethics involved. He's a hero. A hero, a man, doesn't take a woman along on a tiger hunt. So he can't marry May Bartram. It's a matter of ethics. And ethics, of course, is the center of what James is doing. As I guess to a large extent it also is for Hemingway, except that Hemingway hasn't got a specific set of ethics that he's trying to promote. James really does. Of course, the importance of surface detail, you can really say in a lot of places in The Sun Also Rises. Maybe nowhere better than that last page. He's finally gone to pick up Brett, and they're leaving. Downstairs we came through the first floor dining room to the street. A waiter went for a taxi. It was hot and bright. Up the street was a little square with trees and grass where there were taxis parked. A taxi came up the street, the waiter hanging on at the side. I tipped him and told the driver where to drive and got inside beside Brett. The driver started up the street. I settled back. Brett moved close to me. We sat close against each other. I put my arm around her and she rested against me comfortably. It was hot and bright, and the houses looked sharply white. We turned onto Grand Via. "Oh, Jake," Brett said, "we could have such a damn good time together." Ahead was a mounted policeman in khaki directing traffic. He raised his baton. The car slowed suddenly, pressing Brett against me. "Yes," I said, "isn't it pretty to think so?" You notice that all of the surface details in that, where the taxis were, what the park was like, the waiter was hanging on the side, even down to the first sentence. Downstairs, we came out through the first floor dining room to the street. Creation of surface details in order to present, again, the verisimilitude, the seemingness of truth, the situation as it would be, a realistic description of the world. But that very heavy emphasis, again, on the details of the physical surroundings. Much different than Romanticism, where the details are only important if they've got a symbolic content, or they're important in order to generate sensation. The Romantics put a lot of details in too, but to them the details were important because they were being used to create a feeling of some sort. Hemingway is emphasizing the feeling as much as he is trying to create a belief in our minds that this is a real place and this is what really happened. Now, realism, democratic, commonplace, everyday subjects for the middle class. Generally it's limited. Now, when we get to Hemingway, it's not that limited. I mean, Jake works for a living, Bill works for a living, they work for newspapers. The only one who's got an income really is Brett, and she's really living on the money from her husband that she's separated from, so that makes her more or less commonplace. In other words, they're not all aristocrats, as they seem to be in Henry James. You know, even though John, I mean, what does John Marshall do for a living? Nobody knows. He seems to be one of the idle rich. But for the most part, realists tended to draw people from all different walks of life. James is somewhat limited to the middle class. Romanticism tended to have more ordinary people in them. But when they were ordinary, you don't see them as ordinary people. They're the heroic dimensions of even ordinary people. For example, the signalman in Dickens. He's an ordinary working class guy. But he's the ideal working class guy. He's super dependable, super earnest about his job. I mean, he is tormented by the idea that an accident is going to occur on that line, and it's his responsibility, and he can't do anything to prevent it. That really upsets. I mean, he's a noble character. He wants to try to stop the next thing, but he doesn't know how to do it, and that torments him. Now, that's heroic. He's an idealized figure. Most signalmen would say, I saw a ghost the other day, and maybe I'll get another job, or I tried to tell people that something's going to happen and nobody will listen to me. What more can I do? And forget about it. That's, I guess, the way a lot of people would approach the world. But this is a character who, even though he's a common character, he's raised to a heroic level, given the kind of character that he is. Use of commonplace actions, the things that occur in real life. Now, the stuff in Henry James may not seem as commonplace to us, but it was representative of the events of the times. In Hemingway, the commonplace actions. Everybody's either drinking or fishing or working. But these are things that you would see every day. You get much more heroic and tragic action in a romantic story. Again, a lot of adventure, a lot of action, a lot of car chases and stuff. Oh, and there you might even put in under that, I guess, the heroic or tragic action, the death of the signalman. I mean, the focus on that story is on how bad Dickens hopes to make you feel that the signalman died, because he was a heroic character. He met a tragic end. He certainly didn't deserve it. In fact, it's particularly tragic. It's almost like Oedipus. The signalman dies because he goes into that tunnel to try to find out what it is that's wrong. And then, of course, gets killed on his way out. He's a noble person. He doesn't deserve to die. It's his own heroism that kills him, just like Oedipus. And so that's and there's a heavy emphasis on the tragic action in romantics, because tragic action makes people cry. Emotions, generating emotions, what it's all about. Realism was objective for the most part, but it gets more and more skeptical the longer it goes. You notice by the time we get to the end of the book, and Brett rolls up against Jake and says, we could have such a damn good time, and Jake says, yes, isn't it pretty to think so? He knows they can never have a good time. There's never going to be anything will generate out of that. That you can see that pessimism that's left over from naturalism. Sometimes Hemingway is seen as a naturalistic writer, but I wouldn't really say that he is, because at the end of his stories, the floor isn't littered with dead bodies, and if things have not gotten any better at the end of that story, they haven't gotten all that much worse either. In naturalism, the character gets destroyed. Even if he's alive at the end, he's not worth anything anymore. So that there's a growing pessimism. Hemingway is a realist, but he leans a little bit towards the naturalist, but he's not really a naturalist, as you'll see when we get to naturalism. But that growing skepticism. Of course, skepticism also comes from being objective. In other words, if you don't have any inborn ideas of what's good, what's important here, you try to report things as they are, that will make you a little bit skeptical. When things look like they're heroic, you want to look into them a little bit more closely, because you know heroism that doesn't generally exist in the real world. Of course, the Romantics were optimistic. Even when the hero dies in the end, we get the impression that he's going on to heaven, or he's going on to Valhalla, or he's died happily because he's managed to sacrifice himself for some noble cause. There's always an upbeat ending, even when we have a tragedy in Romanticism. First thing a realistic writer would have to be, and notice, is a keen observer. You have to be able to see the world before you can describe the world. That means you have to have a good eye for detail, which you notice Hemingway has. I don't feel like when Hemingway wrote it, he sat there with a map of Paris and said, oh, let's see, what street would you go over now? Oh, yeah, Ron Villa, and then puts that in, and then had his map of Spain. He remembered those streets. He knew what they were, just the way all of us would probably remember the streets that we travel every day. He's a keen observer. The romantic writer doesn't have to be that keen an observer. What he has to be very good at is almost being empathetic. In other words, he has to be a person who understands people's feelings. A realistic writer wants to be able to say exactly what happened during this situation. A romantic writer wants to be able to say this is what people were feeling during that situation. This is their emotional. In other words, he has to be sensitive to the emotional climate of a situation. The realistic writer doesn't have to be that aware of it, except as it comes out in the exchange maybe between the characters. But the romanticist has to be somebody who can feel for other people. Like Dickens. In other words, you have to be the kind of person who can sit there crying over your characters because they're so real to you, because you have put yourself in their place. And if something pathetic happens to them, it happens to you. Realist doesn't need you. In fact, the realist would try to stay away from that. Realists start to get into a subject that would make them cry while they were writing it. They would say, this is not a good subject. Or I'm not approaching this right, because I'm not standing off aloofly from it. If I get caught up in the sweep of emotions, I'm going to lose the detail of the event, which is generally the case. Remember, any experience, you really got to make a compromise anytime anything happens to you. You can open yourself up totally and feel the entire experience, all of its sensations, or you can withdraw somewhat from your sensations and try to make sense of what is happening to you. The more you try to make sense, the less attention you can focus to what it feels like. And of course, again, the further you get away from the emotions. And that's what the realistic writer is always trying to do, present what happened, trying not to get the emotions involved, especially his emotions. The romantic artist did exactly the opposite. Realism tends to be open-ended. We usually at the end of a realistic story, although James is not a real good example of that, at least the one that we read by him, it doesn't come to an end. It just sort of ends in the middle, and we don't necessarily know what's going to happen next. In a romantic story, everything gets tied together at the end. All the loose ends are resolved. There are no questions left in the reader's mind. Big question left at the end of Sun Also Rises. What happens to Jake and Lady Brett? Where do they go from there? Realist says, that's not what's important. If I want to tell you where they went from there, I'd have to write another book. That would be another story. This doesn't have to come to a conclusion. Life doesn't come to a conclusion. I've taken a little piece out of it, showed it to you the best I possibly could, with as much faithful detail to the reality as I could. That's all I'm responsible for. What happens to them after that, that's not my problem. But to a romantic writer, especially since they deal with plot so heavily, to them, manipulating the events is what's crucial. So if you've got a whole lot of events in there and at the end you don't tie them together, you disappoint your reader. A person who picks up a realistic story takes the risk that it's going to leave him up in the air, and knows that. A person who picks up a romantic story, if that story leaves them up at the air at the end, they've got a legitimate complaint. They ought to be able to take the book back and say, give me my money back, I thought this was romanticism, and it wasn't. I don't know what happened at the end, and there are 6 characters wandering around whose fate is utterly left to my imagination. I don't like that, give me my money back. Of course, if it was a realistic story, you wouldn't even think of doing that. Now, there were a couple other kinds of writing which get their emphasis at slightly different times from psychological realism, but sometimes overlap it, and sometimes in many cases precede it. In fact, local color can sometimes be seen as a bridge between romanticism on the one hand and realism on the other, even though there were realistic stories being published before some local color stories. Local color was like realism in that it had a focus on, it saw verisimilitude, the seemingness of truth, as being important. But in local color, it was more important to create the scene, the regional local scene, than it was to deal with the ethical decisions that the characters are making within that scene. So that sort of tended a little bit more towards romanticism. In other words, where, as you can see there, where Henry James and the psychological realist focused internally, the chief characteristics for them is what's going on inside the character. For the local color, it's what's going on outside in the world. How well can I describe this place as it was? Let's see, I think we have Bierce's impressionism. Oh, I'm sorry, Athanase. Kate Chopin's story. This is an example of local color. This using of the, trying to give you the kind of description that makes you feel like you were really there. Same kind of thing that Hemingway as a realist was doing. In fact, actually, sometimes you could argue Hemingway as a local colorist. He's writing about Paris, and he's creating a Paris for us that we believe really exists. Getting all those little details of the quaint little things that occur in Paris and the way it affects people's speech and so on. It's a little bit more obvious one, I guess, here in Kate Chopin's story. The night was beginning to deepen and to gather black about the clusters of trees and shrubs that were grouped in the yard. In the beam of light from the open kitchen door, a black boy stood feeding a brace of snarling, hungry dogs. Further away on the steps of the cabin, someone was playing the accordion, and in still another direction, a little Negro baby was crying lustily. Cazot walked around to the front of the house, which was square and squat and one story. Also, over on 138, when the Michets, Athanasius family, their place is described. You get the little details that could only be occurring where she's writing, primarily in New Orleans, in Cajun New Orleans. The Michets, Athanasius' parents, lived on the old Gautran place. It did not belong to them. They were running it for a merchant in Alexandria. The house was far too big for their use. One of the lower rooms served for the storing of wood and tools. The person occupying the place before Miche had pulled up the flooring in despair of being able to patch it. Upstairs, the rooms were so large, so bare, that they offered a constant temptation to lovers of the dance, whose importunities Madame Miche was accustomed to meet with amiable indulgence. A dance at the Miche's and a plate of Madame Miche's gumbo fee, I guess, at midnight were pleasures not to be neglected or despised unless by such serious souls as Cazot. You notice they dance there until midnight, and at midnight they all get together and eat. Now that's a regional, local, more local color, an example of the way people live in that area. You'd never think that this took place in New England. It's where, and that's of course what the local colorist is generally aiming at, trying to recreate the place. Now the place that they tried to recreate had often ceased to exist by the time they wrote about it. This is another place where they sort of like the Romantics. They tended to look back to a time when they were younger and the world was different. And that sort of nostalgic and that looking back is similar to Romanticism. The focus, instead of being on verisimilitude, on trying to create the local color, the local setting in local color, you notice in Romanticism it had been a focus on the eternal, the struggle between good and evil. Example in the signalman. There's the signalman's struggle between him and his fate. The supernatural is really the emphasis there. What people can do in the grip of fate, whether or not they can do anything, in fact. You notice there's no, look over on number 2 there to compare them all the way across. I'm sorry, let me skip down to, I've missed number 1 on Impressionism. Now Impressionism all these things have a different basic premise. Romanticism says this isn't the world, we're going to try and create the ideal. Local color says I'm going to try to create a local situation which used to exist and which is meaningful and ought to be recorded before it passes away into history. The realist is saying I'm going to describe what happens inside people as it really exists. The Impressionists come along and they say essentially there is no objectivity. Everything that the writer puts down, everything that he sees, everything that he observes is funneled through him. And how he feels at the moment is going to have a controlling effect on what he thinks happened to him. In other words, there's a real crisis and somebody's in danger. They don't even remember a whole lot of what went on a lot of the time. The Impressionist says that's because your emotional state determines your perceptions. It focuses in on certain areas, excludes other areas. In other words, the Impressionists would have argued that if you're feeling sad and your friend is feeling happy, you go out and stand at the same place, you will see two entirely different things. Just as if you went to that place when you were sad and went to that place when you were happy. You would really be in two entirely different places. You go there sad, all the sad stuff is going to jump right out at you. And you'll come away with the impression that this was a sad scene. Whereas if you're happy, the sad things will be modified by your happiness, and also you'll tend to notice the happier things that go on in the scene. You'll come away with the impression that it was a happy scene. And the impression is say, and there's always emotion. You're never objective. You're never absolutely emotionless. There's always an emotional context to your observation, and therefore you can never get objectivity. You can never present the world really as it was. All you can present is how it felt to you when it happened. Therefore, there's no sense trying to explain what's out there. The only thing that an artist can do is explain what it feels like to be there. Notice it goes back, Impressionism starts to go back towards Romanticism. The idea of emphasizing the sensations of the person, and there not being any single intellectual meaning for all of this. Now over under that second part, avoiding tragic or cataclysmic situations. It's hard to imagine it's hard to imagine, say, John Marcher getting mugged in the cemetery. Nobody dies in Henry James. There's no tragedies. Nobody gets hanged, as there is, say, in Owl Creek Bridge. Everything is basic middle-class life flowing along very smoothly, and the importance is how ethical can we act within that basically safe situation. If you have a tragedy in there, it's going to conjure up emotions that will blur the focus on ethics, which is again what he's writing about. The local color writers tended to use sentimental suffering quite a bit. Now, it's not as noticeable in Athenais as it would be in, say, another local color writer, Bret Hart. 4 people get kicked out of a mining town. A prostitute, a gambler, a drunk, and a nasty old lady. And they freeze to death in the snow. That's what the whole story's about. This is sentimental. I mean, the hooker and there's an innocent young girl that they meet. Both of them get snowed on and freeze to death too. But they freeze to death in a very nice, Ally McGraw romantic kind of death. There's even some unmerited suffering even in Athenais. Cazot doesn't deserve what he gets. I mean, Athenais, there's no reason for her to dislike him. He's a nice guy. In fact, he's an incredibly sensitive to her feelings for a husband of the time. He's a remarkable husband, and yet, she leaves him and runs away from him. He doesn't deserve that. Gouvernail falls in love with her in New Orleans, where she goes to hide. And when she decides to go back to her husband, you got why she went back to her. Anybody know why she went back to her husband? What changes her mind there at the end? She's starting to feel sick in the morning. She talks with Madame Sylvie. She's going to have a baby. So now she's got to go back and marry Cazot. She doesn't care. She accepts the trap. By that point. Up until then, she's been a sort of an eccentric character. You notice that's another characteristic of local color, is eccentric characters. A young woman, that's self-possessed, that's self-willed, who can't be cowed by her family, who can't be cowed by anybody, who runs away from her husband. That's an unusual figure for the time, even for the time and place. So it's an eccentric character. But when she goes there to New Orleans, Gouvernail falls in love with her. And then she goes back to her husband because she's going to have the baby. Gouvernail doesn't know that. He's got to suffer the rest of his life because he loves Athenais. He's got in the back of his mind, she's run away. Maybe. And he's been a guy who's, you notice, has talked about free love all the time. He's a publisher and he hangs out with intellectuals. But he's never actually been in love, and this is the first time. And he takes her off, sends her off in the train because he's noble. A little bit of, you can see how the romanticism and the local color, why there's such a, the division between them is not always clearly marked. He watches her go off and he's got to suffer losing somebody that he loved. He doesn't deserve that. He just happened to be there. If this was, If Athenais, however, were a romantic story, she would fall in love with Gouvernail. Well, two things could happen. If that were a romantic story, she could get seduced by Gouvernail and abandoned by him, and would then commit suicide. Because anybody who has sex before, after, or not after, but outside of marriage, in a romantic piece of fiction, or in the 19th century in particular, had to die in the end, preferably horribly, so that good triumphs and so on. The other romantic alternative would be that she falls in love with Gouvernail, realizes it, and Quezzo would get killed then, so she could marry Gouvernail. Her eloping, running off with Gouvernail and living with him for the rest of her life, that's not an acceptable 19th century ending. So she would have, but again, in a romantic story, she would end up probably with Gouvernail. Or Quezzo would come and sweep her off her feet and carry her back. Don't lock a door on me again, Scarlet. And they're off back to the farm and the plantation, and she's going to accept life the way it is. That's if it were a romantic story. It's not. It's got some romantic, again, overtones, but that's the way local color works fairly often. Extreme sentimentality in Romanticism, of course we've seen that lots of times. Dickens going after the pity that we feel, trying to generate pity in us for the death of the signalman, which is completely undeserved. Heavy emphasis of sentiment on there. Maybe to some extent even in Usher, that emphasis on the when Madeline is breaking out of her grave is somewhat sentimental. She's getting back to her brother. Of course, we never really know why she's getting back to her brother. It doesn't seem to be entirely revenge, but on the other hand, it doesn't seem that she was trying to reach out to him either. Poe leaves that up in the air because more ambiguous things are, the less rationality we use, the more we're into the emotions, the more we'll get a glimpse of the ideal world. Now, in place of the tragic, you don't have nearly as much of the tragic in Impressionism because you have a highly personal manner. In other words, in realism, the author tries to get out of the way as much as he can. In Romanticism, we have a lot of first person. The character telling you, this is what happened to me, because he's emotional. That gives us a more direct access to the emotions when it's done in the first person. And Impressionism is similar to that. And the author interjects his comments in a way that he wouldn't do in realism, but would do probably in Romanticism. For example, on page 64, Bierce is describing the scene, and there's going to be an execution there, and he makes little satirical comments on it. For example, death is a dignitary who, when he comes announced, is to be received with formal manifestations of respect, even by those most familiar with him. In the code of military etiquette, silence and fixity are forms of deference. Notice he's making fun here of the formality and the rigidity of the military, which Bierce was not very much in favor of. And a little bit further down the page, we get another ironic comment. The liberal military code makes provisions for hanging many kinds of persons, and gentlemen are not excluded. Notice the irony there. Again, that personal opinion that appears in the story is something you would see in Impressionism, because the Impressionist writer says, it's my moods and impressions which I'm trying to get across. I may project them onto the character from time to time, but it's still the focus is on me, my moods, my opinions, what I think about things. The realist says, I'm hardly even here. I'm just a camera. I'm describing what went on. And the romantic, of course, is highly personal as well, because they want that emphasis on the emotions and the feelings. The emphasis on psychological, as we had seen, morals, manners, and minor catastrophes of middle-class life. I mean, what's really the central focus of The Beast in the Jungle? Will John marry May? That's a premise for a soap opera almost. Middle-class things. No murders. I guess that eliminates soap operas right there. No murders. In fact, it's based on ethical decisions. That eliminates soap operas right there. I mean, there's no, if John and May were in a soap opera, there'd be no problem. They would have gone to bed immediately and then would have dealt with the ethical problems of what happens after that. But of course, James was writing in the 19th century, so that can't happen. But still, there's no earth-shaking consequence of whether John does marry May or not. There is for John and May, but not for much outside of that. You can see a lot of examples of the emphasis in local color on the speech and manners on 145, where Cazot and Montclin have that exchange. And you notice it's written down, dialect. Even the use of French phrases. Montclin says to him, "Foyon, you can let me alone with your decency and morality and fiddlesticks. I know you must have done something, Athanase, pretty mean that she can't live with you. And for my part, I'm mighty darn glad she had the spirit to quit you." Notice we got the speech rhythms of the place, the kinds of slang that they would use, dropping off the endings, the little French phrase in the beginning, to get that quality of this is the way people talk, this is what the region is like. Their manners, how they address one another, how everybody's upset with Athanase certainly comes out. Madame Sylvie's a pretty good example of that too. The way she interacts with Athanase, the way Athanase is dressed. This is another example, of course, of local color description, which you can see. Local color description has a real lot similarities with the sketch. Trying to pick out that essential one or two details that creates the whole scene. There had been a shower, a sudden downpour, short as it was sudden, that had laid the dust in the road. It had freshened the pointed leaves of the live oaks and brightened up the big fields of cotton on either side of the lane till they seemed carpeted with green, glittering gems. Athanase walked along the grassy edge of the road, lifting her crisp skirts with one hand and with the other twirling a sunshade over her bare head. The scent of the fields after the rain was delicious. She inhaled long breaths of their freshness and perfume that soothed and quieted her for the moment. Notice we know what she's wearing, the crisp crinolines and the parasol that she has over her shoulder. Emphasis on what people would be wearing. That wouldn't have been what they would have been wearing in New England or in the far west. Bret Harte had written this, a character with a parasol never appears that I can think of in Bret Harte. I don't think they appear very often in Twain either, for that matter. In Romantic, as compared to that, we would have the exploits of the representative types. In other words, the signalman represents the dutiful worker. As a matter of fact, it really can be seen as an updating of the dutiful knight. You know, he has his job to do, and he does it. He takes it enormously seriously. And the narrator even would be a representative type. He's the good friend. Now, there is some emphasis on ethics in there. The narrator has to wonder whether he ought to give up whether he should go and tell people that he thinks the signalman is cracking up or not. But his decision is an emotional one. It's not really an ethical, it's an ethical question, but he resolves it to an emotional thing. He says he wouldn't feel right to betray the confidence that the signalman had given him. So he finds another alternative. I'll take him to a doctor rather than turning him in, because if I turn him in, he's going to get fired. It's not right to betray him. You notice it's the emotional bond that he's made that makes his decision, rather than some set of rules which he's trying to follow the way it is for, say, John Marcher. In place of that, as you can see under Impressionism, we have the impressions of a single passing moment. In fact, you might even, with the others, are the biography of fine consciousness for realism, and the biography of eccentricity for local color, because again, they're trying to show us the odd, the unusual. The biography of fine sensibilities, sensations and emotions for Romanticism. Impressionism could be the biography of sensation. What does it feel like to be there? The focus on the impressions of a single passing moment, of course, can easily be seen in occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. More than half of that story takes place in less than half a minute. You know, once the guy goes off the bridge and is being strangled, all the rest of that death dream is his impressions at the moment. We even have them triggered. In fact, there's a heavy emphasis on his impressions throughout. When he's standing there on the plank, and he hears this ticking sound, and then he hears a sound and can't figure out what it is, and then he realizes finally it's his watch. The impressions of the moment, what's coming in, how it's being filtered through the character, how it's being interpreted. Again, in other Impressionist writers, I can't think of his name. There's one French writer who's even harder to read than Henry James. A guy goes up a stairway, and it takes him 100 pages to go up the stairway. Because all of his impressions, every thought that's jumping through his head, every time he lifts his foot, how does that affect his sensations and so on? That's the emphasis of it. That's one of the problems with Impressionism quite often, is if you do it, it's such a small length of time, you have to really handle it very, very carefully for it not to seem ridiculous or boring. And of course, Bierce does that real well. Realism focuses on the immediate, but its immediacy is sort of split between what is happening out there and what's happening in the character. Local color tends to focus on the past because the time and place that they're describing is usually in the past. And it's usually a culture which was very important but is either passed out of existence or is about to pass out of existence. And the local color writer is trying to preserve it by describing it as it was so that people can realize what it is that they've lost even if they can't change it. Focus in the romantic is always on the eternal, on life beyond life. That's why there are so many supernatural stories in Romanticism. Dickens' story is a supernatural story, besides being a tragedy. The point that he makes at the end. I think it's on 291. I hope it's on 291. Something is on 291. I know it because I have a little note here. Oh, no, it is 291. The point that he makes at the end of the story. Without prolonging the narrative to dwell on any one of its curious circumstances more than any other, I may, in closing it, point out the coincidence that the warning of the engine driver included not only the words which the unfortunate signalman had repeated to me as haunting him, but also the words which I myself, not he, had attached, and that only in my own mind, to the gesticulation, the gesture he had imitated. Notice the emphasis on the precognition here, the occult, that the narrator has also had a precognitive experience. That indicates that there is a supernatural world. The fact that there is a supernatural means that there is a world beyond this world, which is one of the things that always interests the Romantics, which in fact is at the basis of almost everything they do. So the focus on the eternal here is the focus on the supernatural, the eternal, the world that doesn't go away. In place of that, of course, we have the highly selective use of details to suggest impressions. The focus on the moment in all of its dimension. When the guy who's being hung comes up out of the water and looks around and he sees all of the veins and all of the leaves and the little insects and stuff, now that he probably couldn't actually have seen them, but the impression that he had was that he could see all of that in its perfect clarity and all of its intricate detail. And of course that's what the Impressionist is looking at, what it felt like to be there. And a realist would say, wait a minute, this guy fell off a bridge, the nearest tree's got to be about 30 feet away. How could he have really seen a little gray spider spinning its web there? Realistically, he couldn't, but impressionistically he could. It felt as if he could see even the little spiders. So the Impressionist doesn't care that much that it didn't correspond to what the realist says is there, because it corresponded to the way it would have felt to the character that he's talking about. Slowly down to now, 6. Specific action, verifiable consequence. In other words, what the realistic writer is trying to say, this happens because of it. John Marcher misses the boat, the realization kills him. That's the specific action and the verifiable consequence. things lead to other things. There are natural laws to the way people operate too. Scientific laws we can determine. The local color is more interested in the specific detail and the verifiable correspondence. In other words, they bring out a specific detail. It ought to be like that region is. In other words, if their story fell apart in all other aspects except that it accurately described the region, that it corresponded on a direct basis with that society they're trying to describe, a local colorist would still say it was a good story. Because, again, they emphasize this idea of the verifiable, specific detail, and how that detail corresponds to the way reality really is. The action isn't specific in Romanticism, it's symbolic, and of course the correspondence there has to be that it's intuitive. We know this is a legitimate symbol because it feels like a legitimate symbol. Impressionism doesn't care that much about correspondences. To them, the personal attitudes and the moods are a legitimate subject. How it feels, how the emotional response is where we ought to be aiming. Just as you can use characters or scenes or moods to reflect the mood that the author is trying to create. There's a lot of that, the gray spider, the gray-eyed marksman, all like the soldier in gray who comes down and cons him into going and getting himself killed to begin with. You can use that legitimately. A realist would go, wait a minute, you're manipulating symbols here, that's not really legitimate, and the impressionist says it doesn't matter. That builds the impression of it all being one big sort of trap, and I'm entitled to do that. Psychologicals we've seen avoided the plot because there wasn't much in real life. James is more of an exception, far more in that case than Hemingway. The plot is basically whimsical and humorous for the most part in local color. There's no real tragedy in Athenaeus. She runs away from her husband. She comes to her senses and comes back home again. There's no tragedy related to that. And she goes off more or less in a whim to begin with. It's true that she is dealing with a real problem, the problem of not being able to be her own, in control of herself in a world in which women don't have much control of themselves. But that going off is really an impulsive thing. I mean, at one point she says she wished she'd stayed in the convent, and then we find out she ran away from the convent too. She's always doing impulsive kind of things. Very complex plotting in the Romantics. There are three different parts of the drama in Dickens. We meet the signal, we find out something is wrong, we get a hint about what it is, we find a solution, but then the solution doesn't get carried out, and then we come to the tragedy. Everything ties together, very cleverly laid out. You don't have as much plotting in Impressionism because, again, there's nothing factual at all that happens after he goes off the bridge. It's all a death dream after that, so you don't really have to worry about correspondences and so on. Middle-class characters in Henry James. Colorful eccentrics in local color. Athenaeus, again, she's an unusual character. Madame Sylvie is an unusual character, an eccentric. Gouvernail is an eccentric. Mostly just have heroes. Archetypes and stereotypes in the Romantic fiction. The signal one being an archetype. Or even more in Poe, talking about stereotypes. The corrupt, grave-robbing doctor. One of the reasons they don't bury Madeline right away is because they're afraid the doctor will dig up her corpse and perform scientific experiments on it because doctors couldn't get hold of corpses to carry out their medical studies on, so they stole them out of the graves. And that would have been a stereotype for the time. He's also the guy, by the way, who's selling the dope to Usher. So when the narrator meets him on the stairs, he's got a sly, furtive glance. You know right off the bat there's something wrong with this doctor. Importance of the individual consciousness. A lot of things in Impressionism don't have a parallel in the other three because its approach is different. Now we would just run straight down maybe psychological realism instead of making the comparisons there. It's serious, of course. The loss of love is tragic, and there's no humor in Henry James. You don't have those little ironies like even that you get in Bierce, and in some of the other local color writers. But you don't have much humor in psychological realism. It tends to be pessimistic more than anything else. And what does Henry James tell us? John loses May loses John. It all comes to a bad end. Interested in the internal landscapes. What we go through is essentially the jungle of John Marcher's mind. And that's where the beast really exists. And then finally it's observant, follows the details of what's going on, and aristocratic. You get a kind of, everybody in that is superior to other people in the world, primarily because of their ethical standards. But nevertheless, they're still an elite. You don't have as much emphasis on that in the, say, the Romantic. Instead of the clear, simple prose of realism, local color, of course, has the use of dialect, which we've covered, and it tries to be objective. But again, it's writing about a time in which the emotional content, and in this way, local color is also a bridge to Impressionism. Because in order to conjure up a local area, you have to not just get what it looks like, you got to get what it feels like. And getting what it feels like is Impressionism. So you can see how some of the characteristics from one of these movements is picked up by others. And in fact, you could probably take most of these stories and find Romantic characteristics in them, local color characteristics in them, Impressionism in them even. Local, instead of the internal psychological landscapes, they're more interested in local landscapes. And where in the realistic novel it's pessimistic, John and May lose each other. In Athanase, Cazo and Athanase get back together and, as far as we know, live happily ever after. Of course, living happily ever after gets to be more like a Romantic characteristic. Nostalgic, because it talks about a past and how wonderful that past was. It's democratic. Nobody's rich in that story in Athanase. Athanase's family isn't rich, and the Michets are basically sharecroppers. They're running this farm for somebody else who lives in Alexandria. They're not like, you know what they do for a living. Cazo is a farmer. Gouvernail is a publisher. I don't know what. May Bartram, of course, is a poor relation. That's one of the problems that, one of the things that James brings out a little bit more about her character, how she suffers that embarrassment and humiliation well. But we don't know what John Marcher does for a living. It seems that they're not as democratic as romantic figures generally are democratic. We got the signalman, the narrator, the friend of Usher. Usher is an aristocrat. Most of Poe's other stories, though, have more or less commonplace people who deteriorate before our eyes most of the time. Romanticism we're already pretty familiar with, I guess, because of last week. And now to skip down to Impressionism. The importance of individual consciousness. Of course, that's the focus. It's consciousness not just intellectual, but also emotional. If you look at page 67, is a good example of that. He felt his head emerge. His eyes were blinded by the sunlight. His chest expanded convulsively, and with supreme and crowning agony, his lungs engulfed a great draught of air, which instantly he expelled in a shriek. You notice the emphasis there on his sensations at the minimum. He was now in possession of his physical senses. They were indeed preternaturally keen and alert. Something in the awful disturbance of his organic system had so exalted and refined them that they made record of things never before perceived. Again, his emotional state is also, not just his intellectual state. He felt the ripples upon his face and heard their separate sounds as they struck. He looked at the forest on the bank of the stream, saw the individual trees, the leaves, the veining of each leaf, saw the very insects upon them, the locusts, the brilliant-bodied flies, the gray spiders stretching their webs from twig to twig. He noted the prismatic colors in all the dewdrops upon a million blades of grass, the humming of gnats that danced above the eddies of the stream, the beating of the dragonfly's wing, the strokes of the water spider's legs, like oars which had lifted their boat. All these made audible music. A fish slid along beneath his eyes, and he heard the rush of its body parting the water. It's a heavy emphasis of how this guy is experiencing this situation. The inevitable subjectivity of fiction is another place where they disagreed with the realists and later on with the naturalists, who believed that you could have an objective view of the world. Impressionism says you can't. You change your internal chemistry, you change the way the world looks. Instead of a tree, the effect of a tree. Now, of course, this is taken really more out of poetry, but in that story, Bierce is not writing about a hanging. He's writing about the effects of a hanging. It's as if he sat down and his initial question was, what goes on in the mind of a dying man? And then he goes about answering that question. But the impression, for example, if Henry James's character were being hung, as he drops towards the water, or thinks he drops towards the water, he's going to be thinking about whether or not the act to burn down the bridge was really a right act or it was a wrong act. He's not going to be paying attention to the sensations of being hung, as is Bierce, because Bierce, again, is an impressionist. The focus of everything has to be how is this event filtered through the character, filtered through his sensations, his emotions, his particular mindset at the time. So the realists, when they show you a tree, they show you a tree. The impressionists show you how it feels to see a tree, how it feels to be hung. If a realist like Hemingway had done the thing, we would have had a lot of the description would have been similar to Bierce. The guy, how they march him out, where everybody's standing, all the way up to the point where the sergeant steps off the plank. Up until that point, there's large similarities between realists, and you could almost argue Bierce as a realist up to that point. But from there on, the focus is clearly on what it feels like to be there, not what is going on, what has happened, what is factually. Again, number 11, retaining the impression of realistic detail. You couldn't see the little spiders and things, but it felt like you could, so the impressionist says it's legitimate to put them in. The romantic would have put those spiders in because the gray spider is symbolic of the guy who traps him into it in the first place. And the romantics like manipulating symbols. I'm sure Bierce knew that was a symbol too, but he doesn't emphasize it the way a romantic would. And again, the personal attitudes and moods are legitimate tools for shaping of characters, the setting or the action. Bierce has an attitude towards the military. He doesn't like its rigidity, and therefore it's perfectly legitimate for him to describe the soldiers around the bridge in a way that they seem to be as rigid and uncompromising as is the military. So in other words, a realistic writer would have said, by putting the way you put them in gave people an attitude already. That's not legitimate. Impressionist says, of course it's legitimate. It's the mood, it's the feeling that's important, not the objective fact. Therefore, I can manipulate the characters any way I want. If I want to make it rain because it's an unhappy ending, I can make it rain. A realist says you can't make it rain unless it's reasonable that it would rain. In other words, in the beginning of the story, you've got to show us the clouds if you're going to have them in the end. The Impressionism says, no. If we get to a point where the character feels like crying, it can start to drizzle, because that'll give the reader the same kind of feeling. And of course, the Romantic would have said, sure, you can have it rain, because the raining is symbolic. Every action in the world is symbolic. It's legitimate to have it in there. You can ignore the part about Imagism and Expressionism, because I don't think we're going to get to them when we do. That week sort of cost us a little bit, but in any case, anybody have any questions or comments on the 4 different types there? Take a look at those stories again and see. Now, remember, Beast in the Jungle was realism primarily. Owl Creek Bridge was Impressionism. Athenais was the example of local color. And House of Usher and Dickens were romantic. Take a look at the stories, though, and see if you can find characteristics of the other 3 in each of them. In other words, look at James and see if there's any impressionism in him, any romanticism in him, any local color. Take a look at Dickens again, see if he's got any local color, if he's got any impressionism, if he's got any psychological realism characteristics. Let's see, I won't see you next week. Next week we have Thanksgiving recess. Don't forget, I have made a change on your schedule. December 1st, we do have class. That was a mistake. It will be the seminar on psychological realism, on what we've covered today. So try to look over those stories before the Thursday after next.
Papers are due that day also?
Oh, papers are also due, no, papers are due on the, I'm sorry, you're right, papers are due on the 1st. Papers are due on the
Can't be
1st.
due next.
I'll take them earlier. You know, if you haven't done earlier, stick them in my mailbox over there. That means they'll be in a little pile. I can pay a lot of attention to them. You know, generally I like reading the papers when they're interesting and they show a lot of your insight, so I'll be able to pay more attention to them early on. And I won't be grumpy either, because I will have 100